What is feminism? What is feminism? That depends on who you ask, in fact. So, defining the word is actually part of the problem of having the discussion about feminism because, historically speaking, the word has come to mean many different things and has meant many different things. And not only does it have many different meanings, but many of those meanings are, in fact, often contradictory. Therefore, it's very hard to say feminism equals X thing because you can probably find a feminist who agrees with you and another one who vehemently disagrees with you. So this fact is actually not unknown. It's widely acknowledged by scholars, by historians, by people in feminist circles, and it's what led to the third wave of feminism. Feminism goes in these waves, and by second wave, there were sort of these interminable differences between feminists, and the move to have a third wave of feminism is because of those differences, often wildly incompatible positions about even how to define feminism. So, this is well known in feminist circles. Therefore, to have an intelligent conversation about this topic, I think we need to do two things. One is that we need to define feminism in terms of the actual historical evidence. That means, as we always do on this show, we read the original writings of the primary sources, the original writings of the most influential early feminist authors, and see how they define their own movement. What are their priorities? What do they say that the movement is about or for? But then the second thing that we need to do is we need to redefine our categories around gender and sex and personhood with an Orthodox understanding. And I think that if we do these two things, then we're going to be able to sort of transcend the standard internet talking points and have real definitions and real perspective to begin having a conversation that isn't just about endlessly circling the same kind of internet arguments. So, to preview this and to make it perfectly clear, here's my thesis. I'm just going to say this up front. We should care about, protect, value women. I think that should be obvious, but that's me. But the secular ideologies that have tried to do this historically have proven themselves to be pretty woefully inadequate, as we're going to see. And the only thing that's really able to guarantee human dignity for women or for anybody is the gospel. And no worldly ideology can substitute for that. Again, if you're listening to this show on AFR, I think that should be obvious too, but here we are. So, how does this play out? We're going to look at this in two parts. The first one is the historical movement that is called feminism. What is going on with that movement? And the reason we need to ask the question this way is because what people think feminism means is you need to care about women. Women should have rights and protections so they aren't taken advantage of, etc. And that's a fine thing to say. And I think we all agree with this. I have a wife, I have a daughter, I'm there. Women, we should love and care about women. We should value women. We should protect women. Again, obviously. Uh, but this is the rub. What evidence do we have that feminism, as an actual philosophical movement rather than an attitude, has meant that historically? Has feminism meant that historically? So we need to address this question. We need to talk about industrialism. So what you have to appreciate is that a lot of our conversations occur about this and about many topics, every topic maybe, in a milieu where we don't remember a time before industrialization. That's just part of our imaginative framework. So you have to stretch your imagination a little bit to imagine a world prior to industrialization where the basic unit of society was not the individual, but the household. And women generally managed the household in all these ancient and medieval societies. Now, the things that women did in the household were directly valuable in these contexts towards being able to eat, live, and survive. Women processed food, women did all the textiles, women made all the soap, women, it's just an endless amount of work and things that women did, just as the men did endless amount of work in the same way in the field, in hunting, in whatever. just as kids did too. I mean, as soon as you could hold the broom in your hand, you were helping with chores. You didn't park kids in front of the TV. Kids helped run the household so that everybody could survive. And the thing that's different about this then than it is now is that doing household work, non-cash work, in other words, work that you do that does not generate money dollars, could directly contribute to being able to eat, to survive, to have food, to have clothes, to have light. In other words, people could create things of value without cash as an intermediary. They just created it directly. Now, and that was all of pre-industrial society. Not that there wasn't currency and money, but people were much less dependent on cash than they are now in a post-industrial society. This is the whole context for I think, for understanding this movement historically. Now, the things that women did, the kind of the way labor was divided up, was stuff that could be done in the household and that could be picked up and put down, like weaving or cooking, that you could do over a period of time while you had toddlers running around, while you had a nursing baby, etc., so that mothers could be in the home and be mothers and do things that were directly valuable for survival. With industrialism, society was pushed into this weird cash economy where households could not really exist independent from the grid. You needed to do things that provided cash for a lot of reasons. One of them is that all the things that women used to produce in the home, like textiles, women historically have made all the textiles in human history until industrialization, and yet textiles is one of the first things that industrialism takes over from women. So that work is taken away from women. And now, in order to get textiles, you need to buy them with cash. And you only earn cash by working in the factories and in the cash jobs. So then men have to go out to those jobs, or usually, I mean, women did too, and children. That's why you had all of this child labor and all kinds of social conditions radically changed when the household suddenly became radically dependent on cash and therefore working for cash jobs. But it's very difficult for women who have children to, walk 6 miles and work a 12-hour shift at the mill or whatever, because if you have a nursing baby, you can't do that sort of thing. So men were doing that sort of thing, and not that women weren't, but it was very difficult. What did this mean? This meant that with the shift to the cash economy into massive industrialization, women became radically dependent on their husbands because the husbands were the ones leaving home to bring the cash back. And women were stuck at home dependent on the cash because the things that they produced became less valuable when everything could just be exchanged for cash. And this is a huge problem because it used to be, this is how all traditional societies were set up, women could be at home and be mothers and produce immense value for the community. That's how the world was set up. But if everything becomes reduced to cash, then that value cannot be produced at home in the same way, either at all, perhaps, or anywhere near the level of volume needed to compete with cash. This means, this is sort of the crux of the historical problem, that motherhood no longer fit anywhere into the post-industrial economy. So let me explain that. At every prior period of human civilization, motherhood was compatible with women producing value for the household and for society, because the way that labor was divided in every previous culture is that these were things that women could do in the home with toddlers running around. If you have a loom, you can lift the loom up so toddlers can't get to it. If you're weaving something, if you're making textiles, you can pick it up. Baby's crying, you put it down, you nurse the baby, put the baby to nap, you pick it up, you do it again. You don't have to be on the clock. You can just produce those things whenever. You can just fit it in, especially if you're like slow cooking something on a stove all day long, or you're boiling lye to make soap. Those are things that you can do that's compatible with having kids running around. And then as soon as those kids are old enough to help, they can start helping in the home. You can have kids sweeping. 5-year-olds can sweep. 5-year-olds can mop. You could just do it. So motherhood is compatible with producing real value for, if you want to put it this way, the economy at the time. But now, with the post industrial cash economy, that's not true. Having children means you can't leave the home and go work in factories as easily or at all. And so, the long story short is that, as we'll see, economically speaking, motherhood kind of has to be removed and outsourced to the state and the machine in order for it to exist at all, because now this cash economy, especially after the two income household became standard, just you have to do it. You have to participate in this two income cash economy, and there's no room for motherhood in that arrangement of society. So you really have to appreciate the extent to which industrialism causes the problem for women. Feminism often paints society itself as, quote unquote, patriarchal or oppressive to women. But really, that's just a failure to understand how the pre industrial societies worked at all. And instead, it takes this idea of the industrial society and just sort of projects it onto all of the past, which is what modern people do with everything. We project early modernity onto all of classical and medieval history, which is not how these things work, but that's kind of our mythology. Okay, so what does this have to do with feminism? How is this setting up for a discussion about feminism? Well, I quote Mary Harrington in episode 2 of our series on feminism. She talks about industrialism as being the real start and the real source of women's problems in modern society, because industrialism does not have room in a literal, logical sense for women being mothers, because industrialism's demands is that everybody works as an interchangeable cog in the machine to produce cash and then be dependent on cash. So women as such, women as mothers, women as they were traditionally understood and integrated into, again, every previous society in human history, that didn't work in this new post-industrial economy. So women themselves have to be reshaped into something different than they are by nature, which is what happens. So Harrington identifies early feminism, what's often called first wave feminism, as being primarily a response to industrialism, which I think is very interesting, because industrialism is basically an attack on women's dignity. It undermines the family and it makes women radically financially dependent on their husbands, which Harrington points out did result in a variety of very real abuses that did need a response. And she calls this response to industrialism the feminism of care, which is kind of anachronistic in the sense that that's not what it was called at the time, but that's how Harrington's kind of doing her historiography. So the idea behind the feminism of care is that women are valuable intrinsically, even if their value cannot be quantified according to the new standards of industrialism. So she's talking about industrialism. You know me, I call this the machine. Paul Kingsnorth calls it the machine. We're both getting that from Lewis Mumford. That's what a lot of people are talking about. So the machine only calculates value according to certain principles, and women as such don't fit into that. And so this sense of the feminism of care, to say what Harrington also calls the women's movement, to say, hey, women are valuable even if their value cannot be reduced to the sort of quantifiable values of the machine economy. That's a correct response to industrialism. That's true. However, Harrington also distinguishes this from a second impulse within feminism, what she calls the feminism of freedom. So this is the idea that women need to be radically free from all constraints in order to be persons. And this starts as a response to the incredible economic dependence that women had on men at the beginning of industrialism, and therefore abusive husbands and all this kind of stuff. Not that all husbands were abusive at this time, but there were enough abuses that this became a problem. So, but the feminism of freedom is not just about being free from abuse, it's about free from all restraints, or radically free, even those of biology and physicality, which we're going to see as we go through this. So why is this an issue? Well, it's complicated. I get into more of this in episode 2 and 3 on the series, which we're going to link to on Substack. For this series, the entire series, there's 6 more episodes from this episode that are already on Substack. You can go listen to them there. Most of them are free. So, but here we're just kind of doing a quick overview of all these themes. So, the one that we get into more is this idea that the Enlightenment, which we've talked a lot about on this show, the Enlightenment goes on to define what it means to be a person in terms of autonomous individualism. And Harrington points out that this is not a good definition for personhood, just in general, but it's actually even worse for women because the definition of autonomy, of autonomous individualism, that precludes mothers from the definition of personhood, because if you have a baby in your womb, are you one person or two? If you have a newborn who you're nursing that is radically dependent on you, are you one person or two? And this is why the whole like abortion and motherhood is just like modern people don't know how to talk about these things. It becomes because it doesn't fit the definition of personhood that we've been trained into as a culture because of the Enlightenment. And I talk a lot more about that in episodes 2 and 3, and why Enlightenment thinkers led to this definition, and why early feminists, rather than rejecting it, rejecting that definition of personhood, actually embraced it and ended up kind of causing a lot of problems. One of the problems is that industrialism and this Enlightenment definition does not have room for the concept of a radically dependent person, like a baby in the womb or a newborn, because that entity is not a individual, an autonomous individual, according to Enlightenment thinking. So what's the solution? Well, we need to remake women's biology through technology. Excuse me. Right at the important point. We need to remake women's biology through technology until women become interchangeable biologically with men, because there is no room for motherhood on this definition. Mary Harrington calls this a mother-shaped blind spot in the feminism of freedom. So what's Harrington's take on all of this? She thinks that the feminism of care, which asserts that women are valuable intrinsically, even if they can't be quantified according to Enlightenment machine industrialist definitions of value, gets defeated by the feminism of freedom. She says that the woman's movement, which she identifies with the early feminism, ended with the birth control pill and the subsequent rise of second wave feminism, which we're going to talk about a little bit later and is also in much more detail in the main series. So all this to say, Christian feminists, or people who identify as both Christians and feminists, are kind of in an awkward place. This is sort of my mini thesis, which is that there are women in the first wave of feminism who see the striving for women's equality as informed by Christianity or by the Bible, generally, of course, through Protestant definitions at this time and place in history. But when you examine the writings of the most influential intellectual leaders of the feminist movement from the second wave onward and a little bit before, all of them, this is what's really awkward, all of them are either anti-Christian or just anti-religious in general, or they are transhumanists. They're very explicitly anti-biology and transhumanist. Or they are occultists, actually. This was what was very surprising to me. And so this is so awkward because it's really hard to get away from this conclusion that all of these people are either transhumanist, anti-Christian, or occultists. And so what do you do if you are a Christian and you're identifying with feminism? We'll talk about that more at the end. But let me give you some examples. Don't take my word for it. I was saying the other day, this show is basically reading Rainbow. Don't take my word for it. let's read the primary sources. Now, of course, I get into the primary sources in more detail in the rest of the body of the main series, but let me just kind of go through some of these and summarize them for each of these three categories. Excuse me one more time. Still sick. We're getting better though. Glory to God. Okay, so number one, anti-Christian / secular. So we talked about this a little bit. The Enlightenment thinkers define personhood solely in terms of autonomy. And like Harrington points out, this definition doesn't make sense for pregnant and nursing mothers. But like I said, rather than rejecting this definition as problematic, early feminists like Mary Wollstonecraft embraced those definitions as the right way to understand the human being. So, and I get into this more in episode 3. But many others in the feminist movement are either anti-Christian or anti-religious in general. So Virginia Woolf's pretty famous for her feminist essay, A Room of One's Own. She denounced Christianity as a self-righteous egoism and identified as an atheist. Gloria Steinem is quoted as saying religion is the biggest problem facing feminism. And of course, Margaret Sanger is a deeply anti-Christian eugenicist. She's extremely anti-family. Read any of her primary source documents, and you will be quite shocked, I think, at how anti-family and how anti-Christian she is. And we get into more of that in those episodes. So that, and we talked a lot about that. So number two is transhumanist. So what does transhumanism mean? Transhumanism is the idea that we can transcend our biological natures through technology, can and should. And that manifests in all sorts of different ways, but it's through technology. Transgenderism is a subtype of this, but so is the type of person who wants to, he's like, I'm going to upload my brain into a computer and then I won't need my biological body anymore. I'll be free from biology. That's transhumanist as well. There's a lot of transhumanist themes in 20th century science fiction. You see it in Star Trek all of the time. Anyway, so what's going on with that? Well, basically, a lot of the major writers in feminism after the second wave are transhumanists. So Shulamith Firestone, we talked a lot about in the series. She's one of the definitional influential writers and thinkers on second wave feminism. In her 1979 text, The Dialectic of Sex, she argues for the elimination of biological sex. She thinks that everyone will eventually become pansexual and that biological reproduction is going to be done by both sexes equally through technology, obviously, or else purely artificially. So maybe the government makes babies in test tubes. And she concludes from all of this that only then would, quote, the tyranny of the biological family would be broken. The tyranny of the biological family would be broken. Simone de Beauvoir, who you may know from your intro to philosophy class as the great feminist philosopher, lover of Jean-Paul Sartre. She wrote the seminal work, The Second Sex, in 1949, where she says this, her most famous quote is probably, one is not born a woman, one is made a woman. And, there's a lot of ways to interpret that. But she says that humanity should not take its cues from biology, that the existence of motherhood being built into women biologically is not a factor for her, that we need to transcend biology through technology. And then this is interesting too. She was interviewed by Betty Friedan, who asked her, should we compensate housewives for the housework that they do with a wage? Like there should be a wage for housewives so that they can be validated in doing housework and raising kids with cash, which would seem to be a solution to the cash economy problem. And Simone de Beauvoir says, no. So she says, quote, no, we don't believe that any woman should have this choice. No woman should be authorized to stay at home and raise her children. No, this is permission. She shouldn't be allowed to do that. Society should be different. Women should not have that choice precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make that one. In other words, she doesn't she acknowledges that by and large women will choose to stay home with their children. So she acknowledges that that's part of the biology and that that choice needs to be removed from women and women need to be reshaped and changed. She goes on, I didn't quote the whole thing, but she goes on to say that we need to incentivize women to change, to completely change their outlook on life and behavior. And we need to force them to do this regardless of what they actually want. I talk a lot more about transhumanism in this series in episodes 5 and 6. So those are just a couple of the samples of how, again, major writers in the feminist movement are transhumanists. They're anti-biology, they're anti-family. Okay, so now the last one, occultism. This was the most startling to me as I was doing more reading about this. A lot of the early suffragists, and this includes the first wave feminism, the early ones, are deeply associated with spiritualism, which was an American religious phenomenon that involved people, usually women, becoming the receptacles for spirits speaking through them, especially spirits of the dead. That's what a spirit medium is. A spirit medium is somebody who channels the spirit of somebody who's dead to speak to them. A seance, practicing a seance, is a major way to do this. And many Americans, including people in the White House at the time, were into this. This was sweeping the nation, spiritualism. I have a quote here from the occult historian Mitch Horowitz. He says that at this point in history, in this part of America, which overlaps with the emergence of the women's movement, he says, quote, "You could not find a suffragist activist who had not spent time at the seance table or vice versa." And that's just a shocking thing to realize, is that early suffragist impulses and the first conference for women's voting rights, or something, I forget what it was called, was held in upstate New York, the place where historians acknowledge the birth of the spiritualist movement in America, doing seances, talking to spirits of the dead, channeling spirits of the dead, like all of that, what we would call occultic behavior, was just part of the culture in upstate New York at the time, what's called the burned over district. And that's where these radical social radicalist movements came out of, especially feminism and suffrage. Little known fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, famous feminist of the time, she wrote a commentary on the Bible called The Woman's Bible. It was widely popular. And in the commentary on Eve, she describes, quote, "the courage, the dignity, and the lofty ambitions of the woman," when she's talking about Eve taking the fruit. She compares the serpent, not to the devil, but to Socrates or Plato, asking the woman hard questions that caused her to think, and which, quote, "roused in the woman the intense thirst for knowledge." And then Stanton concludes that uh, she is, quote, "pleased with her attitude as the heroine." So Eve is the heroine of the story, not the author of the fall. This book was extremely popular. It sold out the first printing. It was in print. It got multiple reprints. Very popular at the time. And it completely recasts the Genesis story with Eve as the hero. And the subtext, I mean, she doesn't say this. I read through the passages, but the subtext is that the serpent is sort of Socrates. He's prompting her to think about things and desire knowledge, not the devil who condemns mankind to death and corruption. So then when you get into, I mean, there's a million other examples. We get into it more in the rest of the show. But when you get into the 19th and 20th centuries, something else that I noticed was that a lot of the big donors for suffrage and for feminist activism were occult practitioners of some kind or another, or they were into these alternative religions, Theosophism, New Age spiritualism, or outright occultism, all of the above. Especially goddess worship, which was being popularized by Wicca. Wicca was an extremely fast-growing religion. It's still one of the fastest-growing religions in the West. And a lot of these philosophies, again, we get into more detail in the show, but a lot of these philosophies were widely embraced by feminists at the time, primarily because those women identified Christianity and traditional religion in general as patriarchal. And so there was this kind of hole for feminism spiritually to find some kind of religious outlet, and they found it in occultism, in Wicca, in goddess worship. And so like Horowitz was saying, in the 19th century, where you had spirit mediumship being this huge overlap with suffragists, you have feminists in the 20th century very being deeply identified with religions like Wicca. The first all-female Wiccan coven was named the Susan B. Anthony Coven. So that that should tell you what Wiccans thought of Susan B. Anthony as a hero to them. And there's a lot of examples we could give about this, and I give more in the show. But there were so many that Per Fexneld, who's a scholar of this subject, he wrote an entire book documenting this phenomenon of this identification with alternative religions and specifically with Satan and the devil. So his book is called Satanic Feminism: Lucifer as the Liberator of Women. And he details how Lucifer was sort of this constant symbol, a positive symbol used in 19th century texts, articles, journals for women's empowerment, suffrage, and women's liberation. And he is not writing this as a polemic against feminism. My understanding is that he thinks this is great. And so a lot of the sort of satanic kind of movements, the Luciferian movements at this time, are just overlapping with feminist interests. I mean, there was a feminist journal called Lucifer at the time that H.P. Blavatsky put out. So there's just so many examples, and we get more into that in episode 5 and 6. Here's a good modern example: Oprah Winfrey. Everybody knows Oprah Winfrey. She's sort of a symbol of female empowerment. She constantly promoted New Age ideas on her show. She always had New Age speakers on. And New Age, you guys have to appreciate, New Age is not like this like fuzzy feelings movement where it's sort of vaguely like crystals and whatnot. The New Age is very much a occultic movement out of and embracing and interconnected with all these other occult movements at the time. And that's a whole conversation, but it's not just like hippie feely stuff. It's rooted in theosophic transcendentalist ideas that are very connected to religions like Thelema, Wicca, etc. So, okay. So that's kind of a rough overview of a lot of the stuff that we went over in the show. What do we say about all this? So here's kind of my preliminary conclusion / challenge. Feminism as a distinct historical movement is not really separable from Enlightenment, secular, anti-religious values, transhumanism, or occult spirituality. One way to put this is that there really is no prominent, influential, intellectual leader in feminism from the second wave onward that's not one or more of these things. There certainly are no Christians spearheading this movement. Now, there are Christians who want to take back the term feminism or who style themselves reactionary feminists like Mary Harrington, but they're not the ones who defined this movement. Historically, they're just reacting to it. So at this point, you might say, well, that's not how I define feminism. Sure, fine. You're allowed to say that what you mean by feminism is caring about women. And there are many people who think that. But that's a separate topic. I want to be very clear about this. That's not what feminism, the historical movement, has been about. The major intellectual leaders of this movement want to remove motherhood, unmake biology, and redefine the human species, and probably worship some kind of a goddess figure in one of their alternative religions. I mean, that's just what it is. Historically, there's not really a way to get around this fact of history. Now, why might this be? Well, it's because feminism is a subset of a broader intellectual and cultural movement, the movement of secular modernity. which is rooted in Enlightenment values. It wants to remake humanity, dominate the earth through technology, and exalt man to godhood through some sort of transhumanist, techno, paganism, whatever. You can, if you don't know, have any idea what I'm talking about, we did 2 series on this, the Dark Logos and the Secularism series. I highly recommend them if you haven't watched them. If you have, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because you have to look at these movements. You can't just look at feminism in this little isolated, like, what is feminism? Feminism is part of modernity, part of the movement of modernity. It's sort of one of the inevitable sub movements and sub philosophies of secularism, which is the broader historical movement that defines all of the conversations that we're having now. Okay, so this is the question people always ask. Do we need feminism? Do we need feminism? If you're traditionally religious or Christian, you cannot mean by this term the historic movement of feminism, because again, that's a secular, transhumanist, occultist movement. If you mean instead, not the historical movement of feminism, but this idea that we need to guarantee women's dignity and personhood, obviously, that's true. But again, that's not what the historic movement, the philosophy of feminism as it developed in history, that's not what that movement was about. The Christian perspective, here's where we have to zoom out. Are you ready? The Christian perspective is that no secular ideology can guarantee your dignity or your personhood. Women did not have real radical human dignity before the gospel because nobody did. The ancient pagans had no concept of human rights. I say this all the time. Scholars even argue that the concept of the person, as we understand it today, was introduced into history by Christianity. So if the pagans didn't have a real way of defining personhood at all, in the sense that we mean it today, and still less of the idea of human rights or guaranteeing anyone's dignity, period, then secular ideologies certainly have no way to ground the radical dignity of any person. Why? Because what it means to be secular is to be a materialist or to deny any transcendental morality or to be against any traditional religion. That's what secularism is. Materialism, meaning the disbelief in spiritual things, only matter exists, only material exists. You deny morality in any sort of absolute way, or you think traditional religion is a problem and needs to be removed. That's what secularism is. And feminism is a secular ideology, just by definition, like Marxism, like liberal democracy, like fascism, like all the movements of modernity are definitionally secular movements. And so, therefore, they cannot really ground your humanness, your dignity, the way that the gospel can. Why? Because the gospel defines the human in terms of being made in the image of God, in Christ's nature, in Christ's person, uniting our nature to the divine nature through the incarnation, through the promise of theosis, and so, all of this beautiful stuff that just radically changed Western history when it came onto the scene. And no other worldview, I've said this before, no other worldview, let alone any secular ideology, can even come close to guaranteeing human dignity at this level. So that is part one. When we come back, I want to talk about Orthodox anthropology and what that means for us. And how then do we actually view women and men and gender and all this stuff? And it's not through secular ideologies, as I keep saying. It's through the gospel. So what is that going to look like? We'll talk about that when we come back from break. Orthodox anthropology, part 2. We're going to try to go through this quickly. I'm not going to get into every single issue related to women in Orthodoxy. Female ordination, church stuff, parenting, working women, mainly just because we don't have time. We don't have time. We can still hear you. Hi. We are, sorry, I've been sick. You guys know. Keep praying for me. We don't have time to get into all of these things, and there's plenty of treatments on these topics already. What I can offer you guys, as I try to offer you, is the conceptual framework needed to understand why those things make sense, why all those different issues make sense. So I'm gonna run through 5 things that may be helpful for you to start thinking about this, because obviously this is a giant conversation. We get into more in the main series and into a lot of the after parties if you haven't listened to those, but let's just see what we can do quickly here. So number 1, Christians need to reject the so-called battle of the sexes. You cannot start your gender discussion by assuming that there is an inherent war because men and women are different. This is just repeating the fall over and over again. As long as our concern is assigning blame rather than practicing love, forgiveness, and healing, we're just perpetuating the fall over and over and over again. And yet this is how people talk about gender relations. Well, men are responsible for this and women are responsible for that, and blah, 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 blah. It's like, this is not a Christian way of doing things. You guys remember the Bible? Does the Bible say, bear record of wrongs, bear remembrance of wrongs? Is that the Christian concept? No, obviously not. Okay, so number 2, you have to appreciate, try to wrap your head around the idea that secular categories have reshaped our imaginations. You probably have secular categories informing your views on gender. And if you are threatened by not being able to do the exact same things as each other or as somebody else, or you think that being a mother and raising children is somehow subhuman or not as status as being a CEO, then you're just buying into secular Enlightenment views of the person rather than Christian ones. Uh, and you're accepting, back to the context, the historical context, you're accepting an industrialist standard of value for the human person. So if you have a liberal inclination, you're accepting a capitalist standard for the person in terms of quantifiable value. That's what defines your value as a person. If you have a sort of conservative leaning, then you can recognize this as secularism, as the machine trying to enslave you. So whoever you are, I mean, this is just obviously industrialism's and Enlightenment standards for things. So this is why I've been saying, if you want to put it this way, the Enlightenment is the real quote unquote patriarchy, because feminism sort of has this historiography, mythology, that there's this thing called the patriarchy that's responsible for all women's problems, and it's been oppressing women for all of human history. Now, again, that thing is not the patriarchy, it's industrialism, and it hasn't been all of human history. It's been since the dawn of industrialism. Or to zoom out a little bit more, be a little bit more accurate, it's secular Enlightenment thinking, and it's been going on since the Enlightenment. So that's, if you want to put it this way and identify something that really is historically been oppressing women and undermining their value, it's those things. So and the Enlightenment is so masculine. If you want to use this kind of terminology, you can. It's not the only way to think about it, but the Enlightenment takes this masculine set of value, mechanistic thinking, and all this stuff, and imposes them on everything. And then it dismisses and finally reshapes women's nature to fit its sort of bizarre, innovative categories. And because I'm aware that this is what happened in the Enlightenment, I actually do believe that women are especially oppressed in this age. Yes, women face special, uniquely oppressive to women because of the spirit of the age. It's just the Enlightenment secular values, not patriarchy as such. That said, I also think men are especially oppressed in a different way, and children are especially oppressed in another way, because in secular modernity, we're good at oppressing people. We love doing this. We have devised a unique torture for every type of person. But again, all of this is secularism. It's not the gospel. So number 3 is, I want to talk about this. This is a little abstract, but I want to talk about this quickly, which is this idea of love as the one and the many. So if you've read my book, you know this idea. This idea is that if you want to, what love means is not an emotional experience. It's not, I like this thing. What love really means is being both uniquely yourself and radically united with another person or persons. So you are radically united to your spouse and to your kids, because your kids come out of you, they're made of you, and in your spouse, you become one flesh. That's the language of the Bible. And what love means in Christianity is being both one and many at the same time. If you were just one, that would mean we absorb into each other. If you were radically many different persons, then you really couldn't connect in an intimate level. You just stay sort of isolated individuals. But the one and the many together means you're both distinctly yourself and radically united to others. This is in part what's going on with the Trinity. The Trinity is 3 distinct persons. They're not absorbed into each other. They're not different faces of God, but they are radically one God. Obviously, the Trinity is another conversation. The family doesn't map exactly onto the Trinity, but it's sort of a faint reflection of it. The quote from my book, From Journey to Reality, says how I describe it there is, in other words, they, meaning the early Christians, didn't view love as a feeling at all, but as a way of being. What they meant by love was the living, dynamic state of being in which we are both distinctly ourselves and simultaneously united to others. So this is kind of what's going on with gender, is that with biological sex, is that God creates the universe in terms of cosmic dualism. Well, cosmic dualities. I'll talk about this right now and next in point 4. But there's different things, and he makes things different so that they can be united in love. So the example I stole from C.S. Lewis about men and women is that a lock and a key are not 2 different mechanisms. There's 2 parts of the same mechanism, and the way that they work together to do one thing is by being different. They're not interchangeable for each other, and that's what makes it so that they can become one mechanism. The difference is what actually allows for unity. And one's not greater than the other. One turns and the other is turned, and you can extend that to the biological act of procreation and the way that men and women play out differently in different roles in the home and the life of the children, etc. But it doesn't matter which one turns and which one is turned, because you need both or it doesn't happen. So let's go to number 4 and talk about this cosmic dualities thing. So in Genesis, you get all these pairs of dualities. There's the creator and the creation. Then when creation is made, creation is separated into heaven and earth. And then in earth, there's man, and man is separated into male and female. So you have all these dualities where there could be unity in the sense of there being no distinction. There's just one thing. But then it's separated into dualisms. Why? So that way those things can be united in their differences. The division creates the potential for radical unity. This is the idea of the one and the many, of unity within distinctiveness. This is how we relate to God. This is all over the language of the New Testament and the Old Testament, actually, which is that God is the bridegroom and we are the bride. So we are the bride of Christ. We're the church is the bride of Christ. And you see all these levels of duality in there. And part of the duality is hierarchy. Maybe you noticed that. Creator is greater than the creation, or higher in the hierarchy. The heaven is higher than earth, and male and female are split in a way that has a hierarchy within it. Now, everybody freaks out when I say this? Hierarchy, you've been taught, because you are a secular individualist enlightenment thinker / influenced by Marxism, that hierarchy is inherently oppressive. Now, this is true if you're a Marxist. Because for Marx, only the material exists. There is no spiritual in Marx. And so there's no love, there's no religion, there's no truth. Actually, the same in the Enlightenment thinkers, though they don't realize that their philosophy doesn't have room for love, for spirituality, for truth. That's sort of the fallout that comes later. So, but okay, so why am I talking about this? Because when you have love understood in this way, that there's dualities that can come together to create unities, and that love means being both one and many, it implies hierarchy because that's part of how you differentiate these things. But that means there can be love in the hierarchy. You know, if a parent has hierarchy over a child, does that mean the parent doesn't love the child? No, the parent does everything for the child out of love for the child. This is what God does for us. So why do we flip out when we have hierarchy in marriage as well? Because we think that to be higher in the hierarchy means to be more intrinsically valuable, which is not true. Or that the person who's higher in the hierarchy can lord it over people and control and oppress people. Is that what God does to us when he becomes incarnate, when he dies, when he saves us from death and Hades? No, obviously not. Or when you stay up late with your sick kid because you're the parent. I mean, that's your job. So now, how does this play out in marriage? There's a lot of treatments on that. I don't have time to get into it right now, but I want to direct you to the underlying concepts under here, which is that these cosmic dualities imply hierarchy, and hierarchy is not inherently oppressive. Obviously, there is such a thing as oppressive hierarchies. And so I'm not talking about hierarchical marriage as practiced in religions like Islam, where it's like kind of dicey whether women have personhood, especially in certain countries, or what you may have encountered in the West, which is evangelical types of religions, Christianity, Reformed circles, where women are sort of kind of understood as a slave, uh, servant, whatever. I mean, your mileage may vary, depends on who you talk to, but that there are types of Christianity that go way overboard, in my estimation, with this way that is not, it is not dignifying of women. Just trying to be diplomatic here. Um, you know what I mean if you've encountered it. That's not what I'm talking about either. We have to reject that as well, because that goes too far in the other direction. I hope this is making sense. We got to kind of move a little quickly here. Sorry about that. But there's more in the whole series. So, number 5, this is the last one. To me, this is sort of the central one. The mother is the solution. So there's a special dignity to womanhood that we see all through the Old and New Testaments and the church fathers and the life of the church. Eve is the mother of life. That's what Eve means. And the Theotokos is the champion leader of everything. We call her the champion leader of the Christian race. She's the Ark of the Covenant. She's the queen of heaven. And so that dignity is so incredible. I mean, if you've been around at all, you know that we love the Theotokos, that she's everything to us. And and so I think that, I don't know, I think that people who have a hard time with this don't really have at some level, they don't have a real appreciation for or relationship with the Mother of God, because she's everything, really. And okay, not in a way that makes Christ nothing, blah, blah, blah. But that's the thing, is that her being everything is not separate. See, this is actually a good thing to address. When I say the Theotokos is everything, my Protestant listeners get kind of freaked out, because they're like, well, what about Christ? I thought Christ is everything. It's like, of course Christ is everything. But you see how that's the feminist concern flipped, where it's like, how can you say that this woman is the most important thing when Christ is the most important thing? And that's part of the lesson of the Theotokos and of gender and of cosmic dualities, which is that Mary is everything, and she gives birth to Christ, and he's everything. You see the interrelatedness of the whole thing. It's not one or the other. That's what people get wrong in all these gender conversations, is that they start by thinking there's woman here and there's man here, and we're going to figure out how to assign certain blame to one or to the other, or certain dignity to one or the other. These dignities are shared, because mankind, what man is male and female. That's the language of Genesis. God created man in his image, male and female he created them. It's the same verse. I understand verses are construct, but it's like right in there. You understand? So The Theotokos is everything, and she is the savior of mankind. And she gives birth to Christ because he is everything and he is the savior of mankind. And it's in giving birth to Christ, to being holy enough to do this, that makes the Theotokos what she is. And it's being born of the Theotokos that makes Christ fully man and able to redeem us. Do you see the interpenetration of it? How they're simultaneous. You guys know the yin yang symbol? That's a symbol of gender relationships, according to traditional Taoism, among many other things. It's also a symbol for cosmic relationships between different things. So one thing that we don't think about a lot is the difference between hard power and soft power. So hard power is like physical force beating people up, or if you want to solve a problem, somebody's being problematic, hard power is you just like beat that person up and tie him up and you deal with the problem. The mafia culture, you just like make this person disappear. Soft power is you convince this person, maybe you trick this person, maybe you convince them, bribe them in a good way, hey, stop doing that, you negotiate with this person. This is the famous line that is true, but I hate how it gets used, from My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where she said, the man is the head, but the woman is the neck, and she can turn the head however she wants to. And it's like, that quote is overdone in when it's used in a girl power sense, that like, oh, women are really the ones in charge. It's missing the point, because on this model, neither the head nor the neck is the whole person. See what I mean? That in the analogy, if man is the head and woman is the body, one is not more important. If you're missing one, you're not a whole person. Just full stop. So you need both. And I just give you an example from my traditional Italian family. Very traditional gender roles, everything. A lot of very high energy, high agency people. The men worked very hard, and they built everything, and they made all the money, and they fixed everything, fixing cars, fixed the house, blah, blah, blah. And the men would get together and they'd say, yeah, man, we run this family. We are the power in this family. We're really the ones who do everything. And that was true. Meanwhile, the women did all this other stuff. They cooked, they cleaned, they facilitated the family traditions, they kept the history, they connected with other families, they coordinated everything, they arranged for everything, the family dinners, the social things, the baptisms, the blah blah blah. So and they would get together and I fed everybody. So I miss the old Italian food, you guys. It was so good. They did everything. And they would get together and they'd say, we really run everything. We're the ones who make this family work. And they were right. Do you see how you have to kind of break your binary construct here? The men were right. They did run everything. And the women were right. They did run everything. These things are compatible. They're the same. Do you understand? I'm trying to make this point. So, and the men thought in terms of hard power, and the women thought in terms of soft power. But the fact that you think hard power is better or higher status than soft power shows you the Enlightenment construct, because the Enlightenment only thinks in terms of quantifiables, the bottom line, stuff like that. This is the same with old ladies in the church, by the way. Do the priests run everything? Yes, the clergy is all male. But guess what? If you have not been in parish culture long enough, you're not going to get what I'm about to say, but everybody else is going to get it. Without old ladies, there is no parish culture. There just isn't. Everything will fall apart without women running everything, because the women run the parish in one way, and the men in their capacity as clergy run the parish in another way. Without either of these things, it falls apart. So we're not going to get into women's ordination, but my cheeky kind of argument against women ordination was, okay, if women are behind the altar, then the whole parish culture is going to fall apart, because then no one else is doing that. Is this funny? I don't know. But I think it's funny because, gosh, if you have not been around parish culture enough, if you don't understand that old women are the backbone of the church, the Matryoshkas are the parish. And again, our culture doesn't understand any of this, because we don't part of what soft power is that you don't see it. Just like, hey, everything works magically somehow. And yeah, there's not as much credit. It's not as prominent and visible. But if your desires for prominence and visibility and status, then that's probably vanity. The point is that things need to happen. I mean, it's the same with the priests. Priests are not. Priests are not like the boss. Priests are the servants. They work for the parish. They change everyone's diapers, as one of my priest friends used to say. He's like, man, we all we do all day long is change diapers, man. And somebody's got to do it. They're in there in the trenches. Yeah, that's true. Obviously, there are bad priests. Obviously, there's bad old ladies. But understand what I mean, as my friend always says. I think you're getting the point. So the last thing I want to touch on, well, two last things, is that the church is our mother. You really have to appreciate that the church is your mother, and that this is another way of seeing male and female together. Are the clergy male? Obviously. The church is the mother, though. How does that work? This is another example where you need to stretch your enlightenment categories a little bit. St. Augustine famously says, no one can have God as his father who does not have the church as his mother. These things must go together. Good example, on Mount Athos. Only male monasteries. No women are allowed on Athos because the whole thing is a series of male monasteries. But what do we talk about? How do we talk about Mount Athos? Mount Athos is the garden of the Theotokos. That's her garden. So zoom out. You're like, oh, there's only men on this island. Okay. But it's the garden of the Mother of God. She plants the garden. She grows it. She says who gets to be there and who doesn't. She runs this whole place. Just like you look at the clergy, you look at the church, you're like, oh, these clergy are men. But it's like, but they serve the mother, who is the church, who is all of our mother. So you see how these things are interrelated. They're not the same thing, but because we're modern people, we can't understand equality and dignity without seeing identicalness in function. But you can have different functions and have the same dignity, because in Christ, in being one in Christ, through the single church, our mother, we are all radically equal, regardless of where we're at in any of this, whether we serve in what capacity or whether we serve at all. Obviously, you should serve in some capacity, but not everybody can. That's okay. So, last word on the Theotokos, because I just think this is so important. And I'm sad we can't get fully into all of these things. But I'm sure, there's plenty of treatments on them. I'm sure you've heard all of this before. Is that the Theotokos is not a priest. She's not a bishop. She's not an emperor. She's not a CEO. She's not a prime minister. And yet, we call her the champion leader of the Christian race, the Holy of Holies, the Mother of God, the Queen of Heaven. Think about what this means. I think modern people often get this backwards. They think, oh, because we venerate the Mother of God, therefore women ought to be priests and presidents and CEOs. This is backwards. Because it conflates the value of people with a very hyper-masculine enlightenment view of what can they produce. But it's the opposite. The Mother of God isn't any of these things. And if she was born today, she wouldn't be any of them either. She's the Mother of God. You can't get much better than that. And here's the thing. The anti-suffragist movement of women, which was by and large, by the numbers, as far as we understand historically, a much bigger group than the suffrage movement in first wave feminism in the 1900s and a little bit before, in the 19th century and a little bit before. The anti-suffragist women thought that women's special dignity was, they didn't want the vote. So wrap your head around this. There were some suffragist women, and the majority were anti-suffrage. Why were they anti-suffrage? Because those women argued, and we have their journals and essays and things in which they argued against the suffragist women. Special dignity was in being above the societal machinations of men and voting and all this like blah, 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 male stuff. In other words, women's moral superiority actually consisted in not being involved in the machinations of society and politics. And I'm going to leave you with that if you're really interested in this topic and you're really interested in understanding gender relations outside of the sort of normal nauseating internet talking points that get repeated over and over again, think about what that means. Why would the majority of women be anti-suffragist? And why would the anti-suffragist movement be larger? And why would they all argue that women have a special dignity and a special moral superiority by virtue of not being involved in the fallen world of politics? Think about that. So anyway, there's a lot more in the actual series, and you can find all that on my Substack. As you know, we'll post a link in the description. And we've had actually a great time with this series discussing it in my community. Lots of wonderful women and mothers participated in a lot of these discussions on Substack. People were DMing me. I learned a ton. I actually learned about Mary Harrington for the first time from somebody, from one of the women in my Substack community. It's been great. It's really been wonderful. And I've been really encouraged to see so many mothers and women coming out and talking about how much they've enjoyed this series. And we've had so many good interactions in the chat and in the comments and just in general. I'm really grateful for this community and for all of you who tuned in today. So we're going to jump to the after party right now on Substack. There'll be a link posted in the chat right now. Or actually there won't be. I never sent one. We're going to post that up real soon. So go to zacharyporcu.substack.com and it should just be there on the front page in a second. We're going to go live on that in about, let's see, like quarter after ish. We'll go live at quarter after. And we might have to go a little shorter today because I'm just stealing somebody's office. But I'm going to put that up right now and I'll see you over there. We'll talk about anything you guys want to talk about. We'll wrap this one up before we go to the next series. Alicia, it's been an awesome series. Thank you. I've had a ton of fun with it. Let me hit some. Well, I'm gonna respond to the things you guys have said in chat over there on the after party, and we'll do that at quarter after. And if I don't see you there, that's great. I'll see you next time. Thanks everyone for joining me on this listener and viewer supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio, and I will see you on the other side.